Good morning. Welcome to Cool Springs. Today is Friday, July the 10th, 2026. We were unable to do our normal podcast on Wednesday the 8th, so we're doing it today. This is our series, Big Butts of the Bible. And today we're largely in Numbers chapter 21, where the children of Israel are still roaming in the desert for 40 years. Why do they have to roam? Because last week when we looked at Numbers 13 and 14, they sent spies into the land. They were on the border of entering the promised land. And they sent spies in, one representative from each tribe, and the tribes selected their own leaders. And sometimes when you select leaders, you need to make sure that the leaders you're selecting are godly people who are listening to what the Word says. You don't have to worry so much about their age or their wealth or their personality, but are they godly people? And unfortunately, 10 of those 12 tribes chose people for other reasons. People who looked good, people who were maybe extroverted, people who were persuasive. And 10 of those 12 spies came back saying the land is everything God said it is, but, and that's why our series, Big Butts of the Bible, people sometimes have objections or excuses on why they think their opinion is wiser than what God's Word says. These 10 spies came back and said the land's everything God said it was. They even had proof. They had one cluster of grapes that it took 2 fully grown, strong, able-bodied men to tote on a pole. People can see the land is fruitful just from that big cluster of grapes. But they had excuses, and most of their excuses were exaggerations, half-truths, because they'd made up their own minds that since they've run into some people who are bigger than they are, that they can't defeat them. Well, that's half true. They can't defeat. But they forgot how big their God was. And what they were really saying is that we don't believe our God will overcome these people. And most of the people listened to the 10 spies who gave the bad report instead of the 2 godly men, Joshua and Caleb, who came back and said, yes, the land is everything God said it was. And there are some giants in the land, but not all of them are giants. But that doesn't matter. God is with us. God will help us. They were telling the truth. But the majority was wrong, and so they're wandering in the desert for 40 years. So when they get unhappy being in the desert, having to be nomadic, having to search for water, having to eat the food that God is providing from heaven, the manna from heaven every day, they're tired of eating the same stuff every day. And so they're whack, 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 grumbling and complaining against Moses, against God. Why are we here? And they've forgotten the underlying cause. Why are you in the desert, Israeli people? You're in the desert because instead of doing what they were told to do, the spies were told, go in, scout out the land, try to bring back some of the fruits so people can see it, and figure out the best way for us to go up. They came back and said, well, we just can't do it. And then when they tried to do it in their own strength after Moses warned them, God's not going to go with you because you've rebelled against him. Don't try to go into the land. They tried to go in anyway, and they got their butts kicked. So now they're in the desert, and some time has passed. And in chapter 21, we read that they traveled, starting in verse 4, they traveled from Mount Hor along the route to the Red Sea to go around Edom because they're in a place that they shouldn't be in. They should have obeyed God years before. But they chose to do it their own way, and they got in trouble. Sometimes, as much as you may love somebody, as much as you may try to help someone, and they just keep making bad decision after bad decision after bad decision, sometimes the day comes when you realize the best thing I can do for you is not to lift a toenail to help you again. Let them fail. Because sometimes the only way some particularly stubborn people will ever learn is if they are allowed to fail. And in the really hardcore cases, even letting them fail may not always work. But that doesn't mean you need to continue after a lost cause. If they just have a rebellious heart and just will not listen, let them live with the consequences of their own failures. God could have gotten to that point with this people. He's continuing to provide for them even in the desert. They're not ready. Clearly, they're not ready to follow God into the land that God is giving them. So they need to grow up and mature out in the desert. And they've been wandering in the desert for a while. And when they go through these desert regions, they're encountering some other nomadic peoples who are opposing them because they're basically encroaching on their territory. Their territory is supposed to be Canaan, the promised land. But they're not ready for that. There's a reason why when someone is a young child, the grown-ups don't hand them the keys to the car. Why they wait until they're mature enough before they even get a key to the house. Because they have to be mature enough to stay by themselves and respect the property when they're old enough to stay alone, and not invite in the friends who will trash the place when mom and dad are gone for a few hours. You have to wait until somebody's ready to handle it. The Israelites weren't ready to handle the promised land. So they're wandering in the desert. But the people grew impatient on the way. They spoke against God and against Moses and said, "Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the desert? There is no bread, there is no water, and we detest this miserable food." The miserable food they're referring to is the manna that shows up every day. They don't have to do anything except step outside of their tents and collect it. And on day number 6, they're allowed to get a 2-day supply because they're not going to collect on the Sabbath day. But every other day, all they have to do is step outside the tent and God has provided the food. If you're broke and you can't afford to go to the grocery store and you wind up having to go to a food bank, or if you're homeless, you're diving in dumpsters to get somebody else's half-eaten, leftover stuff, subject to bugs and disease and all this kind of stuff. If somebody offers you a fresh, hot meal 3 times a day and all you have to do is step outside and pick it up, you should be grateful. But some people aren't grateful. These people weren't grateful. This food that they say they detest is the manna, is how we say it. The correct name is ma'ana, but we'll go with manna because that's what everybody knows. Food provided from heaven. But they're tired of eating the same stuff day after day, so they want to wah again. And we detest this miserable food. Well, first of all, if you're hungry enough, you'll eat whatever's put before you. And you should be grateful that it's good food, that it's nutritious food. These people weren't grateful. They weren't having to go out and search and hunt game and do this kind of thing. They weren't having to plant crops and pray for rain and water it and keep the pests away and harvest it and do all this. All they had to do was walk outside their tent and pick it up and eat it. And they're unhappy that they've got to make even that little bit of effort. And Moses is listening, and God's listening. Then the Lord, all capital letters, God's sacred name, then the Lord sent venomous snakes among them. They bit the people, and many Israelites died. This is tough love 101, and God's modeling it for us. They're grumbling against God and Moses. Why'd you bring us out here to the desert? Do you not remember being slaves in Egypt? Being cruelly mistreated by some of the Egyptians who would beat the slaves and make decisions for them that were decisions they didn't want to make, and they could only eat what the slave master provided for them. You don't remember any of that? That you willingly came out into the desert, that you stood at Mount Sinai and told God, you'll be our God, we'll do what you say, and we'll be your people. They seem to keep conveniently forgetting it because they're spoiled brats. The snakes have been in the desert all along. The desert is home to many varieties of venomous snakes. They've been wandering for quite a while in the desert. And up until Numbers chapter 21, nobody in this vast number of Jewish refugees from Egypt has been harmed by a snake. Not one. 32 years ago now, my husband and I were stationed on the island of Guam out in the Pacific Ocean. In World War II, some of the troop and transport ships, as they were battling the Japanese island by island, one of those transport ships must have had a mother snake hiding on the ship somewhere, and when the ship landed on Guam, she was able to slither off and produce offspring in the 1940s. Specifically 1944, that's when the U.S. was able to liberate Guam from the Japanese invaders. Fast forward 50 years to 1994 when we were on the island, and the island now had a huge problem that scientists and wildlife professionals were trying to solve. The brown tree snake, not native to that island, but when it got off, it was fruitful and multiplied, and it wiped out several rare species of birds that were native to that island that didn't live anywhere else on the earth. You could walk into the jungle and it would be silent instead of hearing the birds chirping because the snakes were eating everything in sight. And so they were trying to find, what can we do to eradicate the snake population, because it's not native and it's tearing up all the native stuff. And at that point in time, the scientific estimate was that the ratio of snakes to humans on the island of Guam was 4-1. Well, this is now 2026. We did our time in Guam and we left, and we've been gone 32 years. Just this past week, there was another super typhoon, that's what they call hurricanes in the Western Pacific, that hit the islands, and it did a lot of damage. So I've been looking at news reports because it just happens to be an area that is of interest to me. I used to live there. Now the estimated population of snakes to humans is 10-1. So whatever the scientists have been trying to do to eradicate the snake problem clearly ain't working. It was only 4-1 when I was there. And yes, I do have some interesting snake stories to tell sometimes to people who want to know about our experiences when we were living on the island. But now it's 10-1. The snakes here in Numbers 21 have always been in that desert. That desert is their home. But up until now, these grumbling people have been enjoying God's protection, and they weren't even thinking about snakes because nobody had been bitten up until now. But because they are once again forgetting what God rescued them from, forgetting why they're in this 40-year-long timeout that they have to be in, forgetting why they're not already in the promised land, they're blaming Moses and they're blaming God, and God has decided to let them have a little tough love. He has withdrawn his protective hand, and the snakes come slithering in. And so the people are getting bitten by these venomous snakes, and many Israelites died. The people realized, they at least were smart enough to realize cause and effect. All this time in the desert, not one snake. Now we mouth off against God and against Moses, and suddenly there are snakes all over the place, and people are getting bitten, and they're getting sick, and they're dying. They can at least connect the dot to realize what the problem was. So the people came to Moses and said, "We sinned when we spoke against the Lord and against you. Pray that the Lord will take the snakes away from us." They're not praying themselves, they're asking Moses to pray for them. They're immature in their own faith. So Moses prayed for the people. It's their way of saying I'm sorry without actually saying I'm sorry. Sometimes you have to make a person, not just children, regrettably sometimes grown-ups have to learn it as grown-ups. Sometimes you have to make people say they're sorry. But when you're trying to teach someone to say I'm sorry, part of that training includes it's going to take some training to get them to mean it. Not just to say it because mom or dad is making you say you're sorry, but you don't even mean a word of it. You're just doing it to get out of trouble. They have to mean it. These people are adults. They're in the desert because they were stubborn and refused to listen to God. Now they're grumbling against God, and God says, okay, have it your way. And they're getting bitten and dying left and right. And they realize we've messed up. So they go to Moses and they give this sort of apology. And Moses prays for them. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Make a snake and put it on a pole. Anyone who is bitten can look at it and live." So Moses made a bronze snake and put it up on a pole. Then, when anyone was bitten by the snake, looked at the bronze snake, he lived. You've seen the medical symbol, probably the caduceus, which has two snakes wrapped around the pole. Moses followed God's instructions. Okay, make a snake, put it on a pole. Moses uses bronze, one of the metals that he has available, to make this singular snake on a pole. It has powerful symbolic meaning. There's no magic in this bronze snake. It's not like a voodoo doll that people sometimes will make and stick pins in when there's somebody that there's an enemy of theirs, and they think that by sticking the pin in the voodoo doll or doing other things to the voodoo doll, that the person that it supposedly represents is going to suddenly experience aches and pains or possibly even die. There's no magic in this. But there's a powerfully important spiritual lesson that God's teaching them. They're wandering in the desert. They've got Moses. They already know the stories of Genesis. It's been handed down orally, and Moses will ultimately put the book of Genesis into writing, and he will write down the events of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, where we are right now. And finally, when the people are finally 40 years later on the edge of the promised land, Moses will deliver a series of farewell sermons that we know as the book of Deuteronomy, right before the people pass into the promised land. But at least orally at this point, and possibly Genesis in writing form, they already know, handed down to them, the stories of Genesis. And they know that the serpent was indwelt by Satan, and in the Garden of Eden, in that paradise, it was the serpent who spoke with Eve and deceived her, and she and Adam willingly took of the forbidden fruit. The serpent has represented sin since Genesis chapter 3. The curse that was placed on the serpent animal, you're going to crawl about on your belly all the days of your life, and you'll eat dust from the earth. But the promise of God's redemptive plan was that one day the seed of woman is going to crush the serpent's head. In other words, the Messiah that God is promising to send when the time is right will cure the sin problem once and for all. God telling Moses, make a serpent, put it up on a pole, and when the people get bitten, they can look at it and be spared from the illness and death that would come. Notice at this point, God still hasn't put his protective hand down to keep the snakes out of the camp. They need to learn their lesson. They need to take a faith step. When you get bitten, you look at that serpent on the pole and you'll be healed. And they experienced healing in the desert. And if you fast forward to the New Testament, generations later, the people in the first century would have known not only what happened in the Garden of Eden, but now they'll know what happened in Numbers chapter 21 when the people were wandering in the wilderness and getting bitten by these venomous snakes and still living because the effects of the poison no longer took their lives. And when they see Jesus hanging on the cross, he who had no sin became sin, taking on our sin penalty so that we would not have to die. They know this story. There's a little bit more to this story before we conclude this particular lesson today that I want to take you to, and that's by taking you to 2 Kings chapter 18. This is one of those, now you know the rest of the story. 2 Kings chapter 18. Hezekiah is the king of Judah. So a lot of time has passed. They've gone from wandering in the wilderness to finally, after 40 years, Joshua is able to lead them into the promised land. They have conquered Canaan. They lived through about a 200-year period where they had judge after judge to rise up and defend the nation until they started crying out for a king. And now they've had Saul, David, and Solomon, each with 40-year reigns. And then they had the divided kingdom, 10 tribes in the north, 2 in the south, Israel and Judah. And Hezekiah is one of the kings in that southern kingdom. So they've been in the land now well over 400 years. And they still have that bronze serpent on the pole. You know, they needed it when they're wandering around in the desert because God's not going to keep the snakes from being there anymore. He's just going to provide the cure. You look at the pole, because it's God providing the healing to where they're able to survive the poisonous snake bite. They've carried not only the tabernacle and their tents and their household goods and their flocks into the promised land. Guess what they carried? That pole that Moses made. And it's been in the promised land all this time. But somewhere along the line, Daddy and Mama, Grandma and Grandpa, Great-Grandma and Great-Grandpa, generations back of teaching didn't sink in. By the time of Hezekiah, the people have taken this bronze serpent that Moses made for them under God's direction 400 years before. And they've started worshiping the pole. Just like they're worshiping some of the foreign gods of the surrounding nations, they've started worshiping this bronze pole. They're offering sacrifices to it, like it did anything for them. It didn't do anything. It was a bronze stick in the shape of a snake that they looked at, and it was God that was providing the healing. But now they're mistakenly worshiping the pole. And so in 2 Kings chapter 18, it says, in the 3rd year of Hoshea, son of Elah, king of Israel, Hezekiah, son of Ahaz, king of Judah, began to reign. He was 25 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 29 years. His mother's name was Abijah, which means God is my father, by the way. The girl's name, Abijah, his mama's name, means God is my father. People should remember God's your father. Daughter of Zechariah. He, Hezekiah, did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, just as his father David had done. He removed the high places, smashed the sacred stones, and cut down the Asherah poles. Asherah poles were some of those foreign deities that they were worshipped. He broke into pieces the bronze snake Moses had made. For up to that time, the Israelites had been burning incense to it. It was called Nehushtan. Nehushtan is a Hebrew phrase which basically means a brazen thing, or it's just copper. They should have known. When God rescued them from the Egyptians were worshiping snakes and birds and the sun itself. They called the sun god Ra. They were worshiping all kinds of inanimate objects that was just part of nature. The Canaanites that they're displacing are worshiping false gods. Gods made out of wood and stone, things that you make with your hand and you suddenly say, this is my God, and you worship them, making idols. The people have turned what God told Moses to do, teach them to have a little faith, to look at the snake on the pole, to remember what happened in the garden, that God promised to provide a cure for your death problem, because the wages of sin is death. And instead of connecting the dots, they started worshiping the object itself. So Hezekiah is the one who says, Nehushtan, it's a brazen thing. So he takes it and he breaks it up into pieces. Why? If they had left it and kept it with them when they came into the promised land and just left it as a parents, grandparents, go carry your kids to wherever it is it's going to be located, whether it's at the tabernacle at Shiloh or whether it's in Jerusalem, and tell your kids the story and remind them what God did. But instead, they started worshiping it. It would have been a nice memorial symbol to teach truth, but they've perverted it into an object of worship. And so 400 years later, God moves King Hezekiah to say enough. They're not using it the way God intended for it to be used. So he broke it up just like he broke up and destroyed all the other pagan things that they were worshiping. Now you know, as they say, the rest of the story. The people were supposed to be looking at the snake on the pole, trusting God to heal them of their diseases, their sicknesses, the injuries when they are attacked by armies or snakes or whatever it is that's attacking them. They were supposed to trust God with their future. And so God took care of them, just like he provided that manna, just like he ultimately did when 40 years had passed and that adult generation that didn't believe in the report of the good spies and didn't trust God, when that generation died out, the next generation God allowed to move in. You and I are in the 21st century AD. We know what happened in Eden in Genesis chapter 3. We know what happened in Numbers 21. We know why King Hezekiah, 400 years later, had to totally destroy that pole, because they were worshiping a thing instead of the God who took care of them. But we also know about Jesus on the cross, sin on the pole. He took on our sin. He didn't have sin. He took on our sin. And he paid with his own life, substituting for us, to provide for us a way to get back to God the Father. It's a big butt of the Bible for sure. The people were grumbling. They didn't like the way God was taking care of them. They wanted what they wanted, when they wanted, the way they wanted it. It's why they're in the wilderness in the first place. You're not ready to go into God's land. You're not mature enough to live there and worship God there. You got to grow up. So they're experiencing the desert out of their own fault. And God's providing for them. And they're not happy. So God has to teach them a lesson. And for a short time, that generation gets the lesson. But they fail to teach it from generation to generation, or the next generation refuses to listen to it. And by the time we get to Hezekiah, they have totally messed it up, and they're worshiping an object. In your own faith walk, and as you're trying to impart faith to your family, your friends, your spouses, your current and next generations, when you're telling them the stories of your life, when you're telling them the things that God has done for you, sometimes they may listen and they may learn the right lesson. But sometimes people are just gonna be stubborn mules and learn the hard way. And speaking of mules, even though it's not going to be next week's text because we're not just going through the book of Numbers, we have a study on the book of Numbers available on our playlist. But this study is looking at big butts of the Bible, objections people have to following God God's way. If we were staying in Numbers, the next few chapters, we're in Numbers 21 with this study right now today. Chapters 22 through 24 is the story of a man who was a prophet for hire, a religious sleazeball named Balaam. Pay me what I want, and I'll prophesy what you want. And Balaam is being offered money to pronounce a curse on the Israelite people. And at first he tells the king who's offering to pay him this big payday, I'll come, but I'm only allowed to say what God allows me to say. And the king sends him 3 or 4 different times of upping the bribe. And on the way, Balaam's donkey, his mule, stops and won't go any further. And Balaam misinterprets it, so he hops off of his donkey and he starts to beat the daylights out of it. The donkey stubbornly refuses to move. He's really abusing the donkey. Finally, the donkey gets up, goes a little bit further. Balaam is back on the donkey's back, but there's this narrow crevice, and the donkey is like hovering so close that Balaam's leg and foot are getting crushed, and he's beating the donkey some more. And then the donkey turns around and speaks to him. And Balaam is going to wind up having and losing an argument with a donkey. He doesn't seem to be surprised that the donkey is able to speak in sentences that he understands. In plain Canaanite, plain Hebrew, whatever the language of the day was for him. The donkey is reasoning with Balaam. Have I ever acted like this before? No. Well, don't you think there might be a reason why I'm acting this way now? And then finally, Balaam's eyes are opened, and he can see, finally, what's been there all along. What the donkey was able to see, but Balaam the man only just now realizes there's this giant angel standing in the way, and he's got a sword, and then the angel speaks up, defending the donkey. And the angel tells Balaam, essentially, I should kill you and let the donkey go on his way. And that gets Balaam's attention to where he realizes, okay, I'm not exactly in God's will for my life right now. The angel is warning Balaam, when you get there, before that king, yeah, I know you're going to pocket some money, but you better say only what God tells you to say. Balaam had to learn a lesson the hard way by, first of all, coming in second to a donkey. Sometimes the donkey is smarter than we are when we're not in the center of God's will. We're going to continue our series, Big Butts of the Bible. We will not be dealing with the story of Balaam. I just added that on as a continuation of this one. You need to examine your own life. What is it that you know God has said to you about how you should handle a particular situation, what you should do in your own family, in your own job, in your own dealings with other people? And are you listening to the voice of God? Or is God going to have to withhold his protective hand and let you experience the consequences of your choices, just like you may be the godly person trying to train up someone else to make right choices, but they keep turning to you for help and assistance to keep bailing them out time after time after time, when they're just bound and determined they're going to be a stubborn donkey and do what they want to do the way they want to do, and they want your help, but they don't want your godly wisdom, your godly advice. They don't want your testimony. They don't want to acknowledge God at all. It's just, I'm in trouble right now. Can you bail me out some kind of way? Sometimes you may have to listen to the voice of God if God's voice is telling you, stay your hand. Let them get bit. Because that may be the only way that they're reached. Thanks for watching.